Namaste, and thank you for visiting this talk. I'm Raj Vedam, Director of Arshavidya Satsanga. I'm based in Katy, Texas, USA. My paper is titled Examining Purana Stories for Parallels with Science. So, in this talk, I will give some common views on the Puranas. I will also present the thesis that Puranas contain an encoding of wisdom using the medium of stories, and we'll present the stories of Vrika and Rudra, the story of Dhruva, story of Chandra's birth, the stories relating to the Cyanotic and Sidereal months, Chandra's love story with Rohini, the story of Kakadmi and Revati, as well as the story of the missing seventh sister. And in presenting these stories, we'll bring out the thesis that Puranas also encode scientific information in the mechanism of stories. So if we look at the Puranas, we find there are 18 Mahapuranas, the typical topics being cosmology. They also have genealogies of divinities, rishis, and kings. They encode morals and wisdom using stories, like I said earlier. They deal with various subjects in an encyclopedic manner with medicine, grammar, astronomy, and much else, including theology and philosophy. Traditionally, the Puranas are attributed to Vyasa. If we take a look at, for example, Max Muller's views on the Puranas, in comparative mythology in that work, he says that what is commonly called Hindu mythology is of little or no avail for comparative purpose. Their desire to construct the Proto-Indo-European religion using comparative studies of Vedic deities with Scandinavian, Celtic, and other deities, they found that, at least over here, he says, the stories of Shiva, Vishnu, Mahadeva, Parvati are of late growth, indigenous to India, and full of wild and fanciful conceptions. So it was not of much utility for them when they were trying to reconstruct what they called the PIE religion, as opposed to his take on Greek stories, where he found a lot of information, rich information in a kind of view of the Greek stories. Now, if we start examining the stories themselves, we first take the Uttarayana and the Dakshinayana. This concept has been known from Vedic times, mentioned in several texts like Surya Siddhanta, the Bhagavad Gita. We know Uttarayana, 6-month northern course of the sun, where the days are longer. Dakshinayana, 6 months southern course of the sun, where the nights are longer. Now, there's a story that appears in Bhagavad Purana as well as in Srimad Bhagavatam. It says Vrika, the Ashura, got a bone from Rudra, that if he places his hand on a person's head, he would die. So Rudra very reluctantly grants him the bone, but the minute he gets a bone, the Ashura starts chasing Rudra because he wants to kill Rudra. But try out this boon that he just got and see if he can kill Rudra. So Rudra tries to run away from this Ashura. He doesn't want to die. So he eventually, a divine maiden comes over there and distracts the Ashura. Now the Ashura is enamored by this maiden and he wants to marry her. And then the maiden says, no, what do you know about the dances and the art forms? So if you can do dance and art like me, then maybe I'll consider it. So Ashura says, yes, I can do that. So she starts dancing and Ashura is following her steps. And in the course of dancing, she places her hand on her own head and the Ashura, forgetting about the bone, does so and he falls dead. So this is the story that is there in the Bhagavad Purana and the Srimad Bhagavatam. And it turns out that this story is encoding the story of Uttarayana and Dakshinayana. Vrika is another word for wolf, which we know is a nocturnal animal. It hunts at night and sleeps during the day. So this Vrika got a bone from Rudra, another word for Rudra from the etymology of Agni and Surya, sun. It turns out that as Vrika is chasing Rudra, it turns out that the nights are becoming longer and longer and the days are getting shorter and shorter because the sun is running away. Then on the day of Uttarayana, the maiden comes and kills Ashura. From then on, the sun can grow in size once again, so the days become longer and longer. So very simple encoding of the Uttarayana Dakshinayana phenomenon in the story of Vrika the Ashura. In the same lines, we can see the story of Dhruva. We all know the story of Dhruva. He left home at the age of 5. he conducted severe penance and blessed by Vishnu. Vishnu asked him, "What do you want?" And Dhruva didn't want anything. He's in a state of bliss. So Vishnu makes Dhruva into a motionless star across whom all the stars, including the revered Saptarishi, will revolve. And we see this in the northern hemisphere. Today, Polaris is the star across which all the constellations seem to rotate about in the northern hemisphere as the course of the day goes along. And if you look at Saptarishi in a 24-hour period, it does a full rotation. Or the positions at a given point in winter, spring, summer, and fall, it shows this kind of a rotation. And the story of Dhruva appears in Vishnu Purana as well as in the Skanda Purana. Now, it's very interesting that here we can even put forth a date for the story of Dhruva. Now, when Vishnu grants the pole star status to Dhruva, Vishnu says Dhruva's mother, Suniti, will also be a star nearby. In the present times, Polaris is a pole star. And if you look at Polaris as the pole star location, there is no nearby companion which should fit the story that we see in the Puranas. If you go back to 1000 BCE, there wasn't any visible pole star in the northern hemisphere. If you look at 1000 current era, we know that Polaris is about 5 to 7 degrees away from the pole, and this also could not be a time period for the Puranas. Neither is 1000 BCE a time period for the story because there is no pole star. However, in 3000 BCE, Thuban was the pole star, and Thuban turns out to have a very close companion star. Because this fits the story very well, we can put forth a date for the Puranas, especially over here, the Vishnu Purana, the Skanda Purana. This time period would have been 3000 BC for the age of the Dhruva story. We have another story for the birth of Chandra. The Markandeya Purana says, Chandra was born to the Rishi Atri and his spouse Anusuya. Turns out that the Rishi Atri is the author of several verses for Agni in the Rig Veda. Anusuya, his spouse, meets with Sita of Ramayana, who is the daughter of earth. Additionally, she possesses yogic powers to seed the earth with river, water, greenery, and forests. So the Markandeya Purana has a symbolic union of this Rishi couple associated with fire and earth, and saying it is that which gave rise to the birth of the moon. In such a startling coincidence, if we compare it with modern science, the story of the creation of the moon by the collision theory, that hypothesis says there was an object called Theia, a Mars-sized object called Theia, which about 4.5 billion years or so crashed into the young Earth, and that impact gave rise to a disk of debris that coalesced into the moon. What is even more startling is we are told that Agni's direction is in the southeast direction. Uma, his spouse, is in the northeast direction. Over the course of a Cyanotic month, we see that the moonrise is offset from the southeast direction all the way to the northeast direction. So symbolically, it is born every day between the positions of Agni and Uma, once again reinforcing this fire and earth idea in the story of birth of Chandra. Very, very startling to see how modern science and this story seem to have a parallel over here. Now, there is a story regarding Chandra and the Sidereal month. We are told Chandra married the 27 daughters of King Daksha. Now, it turns out that in a 24-hour period, the moon is offset in the sky by approximately 13 degrees 20 minutes. So if you multiply 13 degrees 20 minutes by 27, you get a full circle, 360 degrees. So every such segment is termed as a nakshatra and is identified by a principal star or a set of stars. It takes approximately 27.3 days for the moon to return to the same nakshatra. So that is termed as a sidereal month. And over here we have a listing of all the nakshatras. Now, the story tells us that Chandra visited a wife each day, which means he was in one nakshatra in a 24-hour period. It keeps changing. And so this story is related to the 27.3 days sidereal month. The story further says Daksha was furious because Chandra favored Rohini over the other wives or other daughters of Daksha. So Daksha is very upset, curses Chandra to die. Chandra runs off to Mahadeva and begs him, he doesn't want to die. So Mahadeva softens the curse and he says that Chandra will be condemned to a life of waxing and waning. So it turns out that this is now related to the 29.5-day Cyanotic month when the moon will return to the same phase. Through the course of this 29.5 days, the moon goes to the full moon, to the new moon, back to the full moon. So the story that we see in Chandra is encoding both Sidereal month as well as Cyanotic month. Now, what is this about the love story of Chandra and Rohini? Why does the story say Chandra likes Rohini more than the other wives? For that, a little bit of orbital geometry is necessary to understand the story. So if we look at the orbit of the Earth is tilted, axial tilt is 23.44 degrees. And we also see that if this is the ecliptic, the path on which the sun appears to traverse, from our perspective at least, it turns out that the moon is tilted with respect to the ecliptic at 5.14 degrees, which means over the course of a Cyanotic month, the moon will go from plus 5 degrees to minus 5 degrees when it goes to the other direction. So this is the geometry that we need to keep in mind when we discuss this love story of Chandra and Rohini. Now, because of the plus 5 degrees to minus 5 degrees, it turns out that any nakshatra that is located more than 6 degrees from the ecliptic line will never be visited by the moon. So when the moon covers one of the nakshatras, that is referred to as a lunar occultation. So it is of interest to see which are the nakshatras that are occulted the most by the moon. And from this table over here, we're taking the principal ones: Rohini, Jyeshta, Kritika, Chitra, and Magha. And I've also given the latitude for the ecliptic. Rohini is minus 5.4 degrees, Jyeshta is minus 4, Kritika is plus 4, Chitra is minus 2, and Magha is 0.4 degrees in the ecliptic. So it turns out that if we study, at least in the recent times, from 2005 through 2018, the set of occultations by different nakshatras, these are all different time periods, as you can see. Rohini, for example, in a period of 1,313 days, approximately 4 years, it had 44.4 lunations, over which it had 49 occultations. So there's 1.1 occultation in a lunation. Similarly, we see Jyeshta, almost 6-year period over here, 69 occultations. It comes to 1.09. Kritika is similar. Chitra and Magha are just 2 degrees away from the ecliptic. And so they experience what we say is 2 disjoint sets of occultation that repeats all over after 18.6 years, the so-called Matin cycle. So we see that although they have got occultation that appears to be greater than Rohini, because their occultations are in 2 disjoint sets, an observer might think these are 2 completely different kind of occultations happening. Whereas Rohini is an extremal, being at 5 degrees in the ecliptic. Rohini experiences a continuous set of occultations over a 4-year period, repeating all over after 18.6 years. So we see that because of the geometry that it presents in terms, the moon presents in terms of going around the Earth, and the occultation that it does of the principal constellations, we see that it turns out that Rohini would have been occulted the most. So this seems to be encoded in the love story of Chandra and Rohini, that Chandra likes Rohini the most. Now, it's also very interesting that we have a story of Kakadmi and Revati that appears in Srimad Bhagavatam. And it is very, very intriguing to see that we can derive a modern estimate of what is the extent of Brahmaloka from this. Now, the Srimad Bhagavatam says that Kakadmi was a king whose daughter Revati was very accomplished and he couldn't find a spouse for her. So he sets off to Brahmaloka to ask Brahma himself, where is a suitable match, a husband for my daughter Revati? When he gets there, Brahma is enjoying a Gandharva concert. So he and his daughter wait until the concert is over. And then Brahma asks him, why have you come here? And Kakadmi says so. And Brahma laughs and says, in the time period of waiting for the concert to be over, 27 Chaturyugas are over on earth. That turns out to be something like 116.64 million years. Now, if we can compute, for example, that each minute of Brahma is 6 million Earth years from the timeline of Brahma that we have in, for example, in Surya Siddhanta, it turns out that Brahma's concert took approximately 19 minutes, 22 seconds in dilated time to cover this 116.64 Earth years. Further, if we also make the assumption, we're not saying it is a possibility, but seeing a parallel over here with science. If Kakadmi and Revati had traveled at nearly the speed of light, therefore experiencing time dilation, they would have got to a distance that is shown over here. We are the Milky Way galaxy, and our closest neighbor is the Andromeda galaxy at about 2 million light years from us. In an 8 million year radius, we have what we call the local group and the nearest galaxies in 8 million light years. We are part of something called the Virgo supercluster, which is a supercluster of many other clusters of galaxies. Virgo supercluster and other superclusters form part of what we call the Laniakea supercluster that is shown over here. Laniakea supercluster has got a radius of approximately this dimension shown over here, 116 million light years. So it's intriguing to see in the context of modern understanding what the story of Kakadmi is saying in terms of the extent of Brahmaloka, which turns out to be the Laniakea supercluster. It's also interesting that there are parallel stories in both the Indian tradition and the Greek tradition. And here is one such example. This is a story of the missing seventh sister. Now, the Pleiades were 7 virginal sisters who were companions of the goddess called Artemis. Artemis was a goddess of hunt. Now, it turns out that Orion the hunter, one day he sees them at play and he's enamored by these sisters and he starts chasing them, much to the dismay of Artemis, who doesn't like it. So Artemis has Orion killed by a scorpion eventually. And Zeus, the god, he immortalizes Orion and the Pleiades as stars in the sky, and that's the Pleiades constellation. Here's a familiar big Orion constellation, and the Pleiades is a small cluster of stars that you see over here. Question is, where is the 7th Pleiades? Because you only see 6 Pleiades without a telescope. If you look in the naked eye, that's all you see. Well, the Greek tradition says the 7th sister was called Merope, and she had an affair with a mortal man, and she hid her face in shame, and therefore she became the missing 7th sister. Now, what about the Indian tradition? Markandeya Purana says that at Homo the Saptarishis, Agni was besotted with their lovely wives, Saptarishis' wives. He was thoroughly ashamed of himself, and how can he be attracted to married women? He goes up and does tapasya. Now, Agni's companion was Swaha, and she had unrequited love for Agni. So she practiced deception by taking advantage of his weakness. His weakness was for the Saptarishis' wives. So Swaha takes on the form of the 6 Saptarishis' wives and seduces Agni. However, she could not assume the form of Arundhati, who was a very chaste lady. Her chastity prevented her form from being usurped by Swaha. As a result, now the 6-headed Kartikeya or Skanda was born, and it caused great disturbance. And the forest dwellers, they had seen what they believed were the Saptarishis' wife and their relationship with Agni. And so they went and complained to the gods that this is what we saw. Now the Saptarishis' wives, who were very innocent, they left their husbands in great shame because of what people were saying, and they went off and became the Kritika Nakshatra. Kritika Nakshatra is once again the Pleiades in Greek tradition. So the missing sister is Arundhati, whose form could not be assumed, and she turns out to be remaining with her husband. Vashishta Arundhati is the tail of the Saptarishi complex over here. It's a binary star. She remains with her husband. So in the Indian tradition, we see the reason why this is the missing 7th sister. And in both the Greek tradition and Indian tradition, there is this story of illicit romance that is hiding over here, but there's an inversion of the story. So in concluding remarks, I hope I have made a point over here to show that Puranas form an encyclopedic section of Smriti literature. The pedagogy in Puranas involves encoding science and entertaining stories. Unlocking the wisdom requires knowing the metaphor used by the author. And once we do that, we can understand what the author might have intended to communicate. And I have taken up these stories, Uttarayana and Dakshinayana, Dhruva, the pole star, the age of the story, Sidereal and Cyanotic months, Chandra, Rohini, love story, the extent of Brahmaloka, Kritikas and Pleiades, and the commonality of stories. Thank you for listening to this talk. Namaste.